This is Trepp Wire Week in Review for week ending July 31st. I'm Martha Kocher with Trepp, a data modeling and analytics firm for the CMBS commercial real estate and CLO markets. I'm with our subject matter experts, Manus Clancy, Senior Managing Director, and Joe McBride, Head of CRE Finance. And this week we're joined by another one of our experts, Lonnie Hendry, Head of Advisory Services for CRE. He'll do a deep dive into a regulatory rule known as 1031 exchange. But first, this week, a wave of new economic data suggests that the recovery has stalled. New jobless claims tick upwards slightly again, and since the pandemic, only 1/3 of jobs lost have returned. The quarterly GDP drop of 32.9% is the worst on record, telling us what we have already known: we spent less in the second quarter. The Fed extended lending facilities until the end of the year, and lawmakers introduced a new relief bill aimed at the hammered hotel and real estate industries. And the FDA signals rapid vaccine approval. Thank you for joining us again, Lonnie. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It seems that hope of a speedy recovery is not going to happen. You're in one of the hot spots right now where cases are rising in Texas. What are your observations there?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Texas kind of lives by a moniker of everything's bigger in Texas. We wanted to make sure that the coronavirus was no different. So when New York jumped out to an early lead, I think we put some policies in place that ensured that we would catch up. And unfortunately, in this instance, we have. So, we were one of the first states to reopen, and I think that's had some negative consequences to the overall numbers. And so we've seen a pretty dramatic pullback. The governor had usurped some of the local elected officials' power by issuing an executive order early on that overrode their mask requirements at the city level and said that there were going to be no mask requirements in Texas. And then when the number spiked, he had to reluctantly issue a mask mandate statewide. And so we think things have leveled off and hit a plateau. So hopefully we're on the back end of that, but certainly has caused some trepidation in the market here in Texas.
They must have not heard Manus's mask rant from a couple of weeks ago.
Got to wear the mask. It's patriotic. It's interesting because only a couple of days after we said this, the president came out and said the same thing. So
I wonder if
I will go to my grave believing that he went to bed the night before that tweet went out, thinking and listening to the Trepp podcast, and he came out and said that's a great idea, and I'm going to run with that tomorrow. He didn't give us credit for it, but in my mind, that's exactly how it played out.
For better or for worse, that would have led to a lot of downloads.
Manus, Trepp is about to release the July delinquency numbers with some unprecedented movement. How did we do?
We had flagged this about a week ago. We put out preliminary numbers that indicated that the delinquency rate was likely to fall. When the final numbers came in, and we'll publish them on Friday morning, July 31st, we're recording this on Thursday, July 30th, the overall delinquency rate will drop from 10.3% in June to 9.6% in July, which sounds like a great turn, but there's a lot of nuance to that number, just like there's a lot of nuance to the unemployment numbers, the GDP numbers, and so forth that make calling a top to any one of these markets or any one of these data points, or a bottom as the case may be, very difficult. The fall in the delinquency rate in July came from a huge chunk of cures, meaning loans that were delinquent in some form or another in June that went back to current or within the grace period in July. That number totaled well over $8 billion. Some of that was extensions, real bona fide extensions where the maturity date was pushed out, which we've covered in Trepp Wire extensively. Some forbearances of the sort where the borrower can use reserves to keep the loan current in terms of P&I payment, that type of forbearance. In some of those cases, the loan was made current, but the paid to date remained in April. So you can kind of tell that those were those types of forbearances. And then of the 8 billion, a lot of loans, it was really unclear because the special servicer notes or the watch list notes were not completely descriptive as to how the loan cured. whether the borrower pulled out of his pocket to make the loan current or whether some kind of relief was granted. We're going to do a little bit more scratching beneath the surface next week into the comments deeper and come out with a better sense of that. But just by order of magnitude, 2.6 billion of the loans were ones that became current in status but still had an April paid to date. That represents a 47 basis point drop in the delinquency rate. If those loans were to be considered delinquent, you would have been really close to that 10.3% number from last month. And if you included some portion of the cures as having forbearances, you know, it's probably not out of the question that 50% of those might have been forbearances, you know, use of reserve relief. Then the delinquency rate this month might have been closer to, you know, 11.5%. So it's very, very tough to say. And we'll get into some of the property type numbers momentarily.
So I think, Manus, you know, what you're trying to say with that detail is that although the rate dropped, the true payment rate may not have improved, right? We had somebody on Twitter, I think, come up with a good name for it, right? It was like the something paid through rate, like the rapid paid through rate or something like that. We call it the Raptor. Maybe that's what we have to call it, and give them props. But something that I noticed in the numbers, as well as you did, was that the special servicing rate didn't drop, right? So I think especially for overall, the special servicing rate increased, but then in retail and lodging, they both increased up to 24% for lodging, up from 20.5%, 16% in retail, up from 14.2%. So it seems as if those cures are remaining in special servicing and there are new loans getting added to the special servicing number there. On the other side of the equation, the grace period numbers, meaning the loans that have not made a payment for a month or just over a month, but they're not considered delinquent, those numbers are lower. They're 2.83% in July as compared to 4.1% in June. So that is good. There's not as much new pipeline of new delinquencies, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a second wave of, you know, some of these deals that went into forbearance come out and still have trouble, or borrowers that were holding out for the last couple of months, and now with the second round of lockdowns, they finally say, you know what, that's it. I'm going to stop putting my own cash into this thing and start talking to the special servicer.
There's a lot of ways that this can go, right? We said before that we think that the worst months are behind us in terms of increases, right? We've seen 3% and 4% increases per month. I think that that's behind us, because if you didn't need relief in April, May, and June, you know, now that things are opening in many parts of the country, theoretically, you shouldn't need it in July and August. But I do believe that there could be some borrower fatigue, as you kind of hinted at, which is they keep it going for a while, but then they finally throw in the towel. So how could this can get better, or how could this get worse? It gets worse if these forbearances end. Borrowers have to reach into their pocket, not only for their regular P&I payment, but to replenish their reserves, and new pauses, new relief, new forbearances are not granted, right? That would push the number higher. Although if we go in that direction, as I said, I think we're seeing, you know, an 11 and then a 12 and then a 13% delinquency rate. We're not going from 10 to 13 to 16 to 20, right? On the other side of it, now that we have the HOPE Act, which we'll dive into a little bit more in detail later, that may elongate the process. You may have more people holding on longer, saying, as long as this thing is a possibility, I'm going to, you know, keep this thing alive any way I can, and that could keep a lid on the delinquency rate.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and we'll get into the HOPE Act in a little bit, but usually when borrowers stop performing or they stop making payments and the loan goes to special servicing, a lot of times the reporting of their underlying financials kind of slows down or stops altogether. I'll be interested to see if that still remains the case, because this new preferred equity plan, that if it does go into law, it's kind of a stimulus package for CMBS borrowers. You need to prove that your revenue has dropped by a certain amount So it'd be interesting to see if they continue to report these financial numbers, even though historically they probably wouldn't have, put that data out there.
Please don't stay at my hotel. I'm at, 26% drop right now. If you come into my hotel this week, I'm going to be ineligible for my.
That's right. Turn people away, or I'll give you a free room.
Right. Exactly. Just don't trash it.
Just bring your own sheets.
That's right.
Speaking of which, by the way, I just want to throw a shout out to our guy, Don Sheets, who we had an interview with earlier in the week. I was not planning that segue, by the way. It just came up naturally. He was great. We talked about the state of the distressed commercial real estate debt market. He gave a lot of great insight into, the types of deals he's seeing, how he underwrites things, him and his team. Also, he did a cross-country road trip a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple of months ago, and he gave us a breakdown of all the different cities and how different, the vibes were in all those different cities. We've gotten a ton of, listener feedback on that they really enjoyed it, and they reached out to connect with Don and get onto his kind of distribution list. So definitely give that a listen.
In terms of property types, the three that have been performing well, industrial, multifamily, and office, also their delinquencies dip slightly or stay flat. So the haves continue to have. Lodging delinquencies fell very slightly to 23.8%, still a tragically high number. Retail still at 16%. In terms of watch list, 35% of hotels are on watch list, 24% of retail. On the special servicing side, 24% with special servicer among hotels. That was up 4% last month, and 16% for retail. That was up 2%. So, it's a case of the haves and have-nots in the commercial real estate. And as we get into the HOPE Act conversation, what we'll find is that these guys that are really getting by will not qualify. And this will end up being an act, should it pass, for really hotel borrowers and retail guys almost exclusively.
So I'm getting a stream of pictures sent to my phone from my wife right now. I have to give her a shout out. It is our anniversary today. So good on us. She's at the Danbury Mall in Connecticut, and she's sending me pictures of the parking lot. So that's an award-winning listener right there, to be giving us an update from on the ground. The parking lot is actually pretty full. There's a line out the door at Trader Joe's, which is not really surprising. Grocery is still doing well. But I'd say from these pictures, 1/3 to a half full on the parking lot. And one of these pictures is outside of a Macy's. So, Danbury Mall doing fairly well. We'll have to start traveling to some of these other malls to see how they're doing.
You got to find out if there's a movie, right? Are they there for the movie?
You mean a movie being
in the drive-in?
Oh,
right,
the drive-in movie
in the parking lot, right? That would be the big corrupter of the data.
Well, I was wondering if it's like a park and ride for a commute or something like that, because sometimes that's a tell, right? Or
no,
like you said,
it's
a data corrupter.
We were talking about retail, and there was some news in retail, especially about Sycamore Partners and JC Penney, but it was a back and forth, Manus. What happened there?
Well, we reported on this in our Trepp Wire, one of many stories we covered this week, some of which we'll go through later. There was word being reported by several outlets that Sycamore had the top bid with $1.75 billion for JC Penney. If they were to win, the rumor was that they were going to merge it with Belk's. Sycamore already owns Belk's. Sycamore, by the way, is a private equity firm. They were going to close JC Penney stores in markets where Belk's already had a footprint, and keep open stores where Belk's wanted to expand. Later, after the report, a lawyer for JC Penney emphatically denied the report. Had it happened, what we were concerned about and what we started looking for was, where was there overlap between JC Penney and Belk's? And there was considerable overlap, and that was something that could have rattled both the CMBS market overall and specific CMBS deals and CMBX indices, but they've since walked that back. Other bidders include Hudson Bay, retailer Hudson Bay, and the combination of Simon and Authentic brands, and all of the bids seem to be fairly close to one another. So the situation is fluid. Incidentally, that Simon Authentic brands combo was also the stalking horse bidder for Brooks Brothers with a $305 million bid. So a lot of moving parts out there, a lot to follow in the coming weeks. And, JC Penney was a borrower in the CLO market, and Sycamore also has plenty of bulk debt in the CLO space as well. So incredible number of angles for this story.
So, let me ask a dumb question, as I usually do. And maybe Lonnie or Manus, one of you guys knows, but what's the play if a Simon Property Group buys a Brooks Brothers or, a JC Penney? Don't they still have the same problem as before?
I think they do, but I think there's some inherent risk that they're trying to avoid. So if they have co-tenancy clauses with some of their other tenants in those retail centers, and they can keep those spaces open, even if it's not for profit necessarily, or at least what they want, they don't have to enforce those co-tenancy clauses or have those enforced upon them by the other tenants in the space. So I would assume that's one of the motivations. I think also, if they can resurrect or, use some innovative tactics to maybe use some of those acquisitions at a below market price from the initial acquisition, maybe they can try some of their own internal strategies from a marketing, a repositioning campaign, but at a below market entry level price.
Right. And I guess JC, like a company like JC Penney, oftentimes actually owns their box, right? So Simon might own the inline and the parts of the mall, but they don't own the JC Penney box. So this is a good way to kind of round out the property at a discounted price. The co-tenancy basically means a lot of the other tenants in the mall, they have a lease for whatever, 5 or 7 years, but they have something built into the lease which says if JC Penney leaves, then I get to break my lease. And that makes sense because they always say that, or at least historically, the big boxes, the anchor tenants were the ones that drove foot traffic to a mall. And that's why, a smaller, I always use Annie Ann's or something, a smaller tenant like Aeropostale or somebody would have that in there and say, if JC Penney goes away, we're losing all our foot traffic, so I don't want to be here anymore. We
did see some interesting deals this week that we wanted to highlight. So Manus, deals of the week.
Yes, a new segment for us that we hope to repeat every week to single out some of the things that are happening around the country. There's so much negativity between bankruptcies and store closings, but there's also a lot of activity. Last week, we focused on some big leases signed in New York and a property sale in San Francisco, which were really signs of faith that those markets were going to come back, and we were really optimistic about those. We'll give you a couple of deals, the deal of the week and a couple of runner-ups. The deal of the week is from the great state of Maine. That's in honor of our producer, Keegan. He was said to be a playground hoops legend in the Pine Tree State, once known as Air Portland, and sometimes the Kennebunkport Kangaroo. He was kind of like the Herman the Helicopter from Rucker Park, of the Maine playgrounds. But the deal of the week came from a consulting and accounting firm, Berry Dunn, taking almost 90,000 square feet at 2211 Congress Street in Portland. The firm was represented by, or I should say the owner of the building was represented by the Bolos Group, Drew Sigfridson, Craig Young, and John Rizzo of Bolos represented the owner of the property, along with Tim Stewart of Cushman, Chris Pazik and Jessica Estes of Bolos represented Berry Dunn. So that's a big deal up there. They did leave a property which backs CMBS debt, which we covered in Trepp Wire. So read that if you're interested. And I'll cut to two other deals momentarily. Joe, you have something to throw in there.
I just thought that it's interesting that the very first deal of the week segment, you happen to choose the deal with the most hard to pronounce names involved.
Yes. It's been something else, for the last 3 or 4 months. We just have so many retailers I can't pronounce, last names, firms. It's a
Unless it's a
crisis.
French name. If it's a French name, you're good. Like Au Bon Paul.
I don't know.
No, he can't do that either.
I don't even speak English well. Other notable deals this week that we covered in Trepp Wire. The Michaels Companies is taking 125,000 square feet of space at Royal Ridge 3 in Irving, Texas. That's a big deal to the CMBS market. As we noted in Trepp Wire a few years ago, that space was occupied by American Airlines in full. They terminated that lease, leaving the parcel, the building vacant. Michaels now backfills that entire space. The property backs a $46.7 million loan from 2011 that's due to mature in about a year. So a great deal there. And lastly, CBRE arranged an 80,000 square foot renewal at Wells Fargo Plaza in Minneapolis. Brian Wasserman and, wait for it, Joe Konzamias of CBRE in Minneapolis represented the owners of the building. So 3 deals of the week. And if you'd like to submit your deal of the week in the future, email us at podcast@trepp.com, and we'll try to give a shout out to those that have interesting deals that show their markets recovering.
Yeah, I like that. I love this idea. I mean, I think we'll try to sprinkle in all sorts of things, transactions on the leasing side, on the mortgage side, and on the, straight up purchase and sale side. We've been hearing this for the entire quarantine, which is there's just not enough transaction volume happening for us to find a good price or for us to find a good value or whatever it is. And so we're starting to see that pick up. And it's really good, I think, especially in our world today, to highlight some good positive activity in the market.
While we're talking about Portland, Maine, let me throw in a couple of other things, and also people pinging us with deals. A couple of shout outs this week. MK, thanks for listening in Portland, Maine, and your Hope Act thoughts. We look forward to addressing them shortly. Sully in Connecticut, thanks for listening on your weekly run. RD, also with some Hope Act comments. Thank you for listening. And FK from the Windy City, thanks for tuning in.
From the Windy City. RD, one of our favorites.
Yes. We learn more from RD than he learns from us, I think.
It's not so bad. So office is a sector that we will be doing some more analysis on in the coming week. Lonnie, you have some previews of what that data is probably going to show us.
Yeah, I think the office sector is very interesting. So Manus outlined some of the delinquency numbers a moment ago, and still heavily focused on retail and lodging. But I think there's some growing concern in the office market as it pertains to shadow vacancy in subleased space. And so you've seen across, some of the larger U.S. Metro markets in the office space, a lot of sublease space come available. So we're going to do some research and put some content out that tracks those markets. It's interesting. CBRE put a story out last week where they actually sized up the top 10 markets. Houston, Texas was the only market to see a negative change, which actually would be a positive in this instance. But I think their market has, shadow or sublease space at all times. So that's not really an indicator. So, Manhattan, San Francisco, Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, all negatively impacted from this. I think what'll be interesting to see is over the next few months, are these spaces taken down at discounted rates? Do the existing tenants, quit paying if they can't get it subleased? So I think those will be some things we delve into in our piece. We have the shadow vacancy, which is the actual shadow vacancy, right? The amount of space that's for lease or for sublease. And then there's another element, which has never really been tracked, which is the physical vacancy, I guess you could say, which is like, okay, this building is 100% occupied, but there's nobody going to it every day, right? Which I think is the case in Midtown, in Manhattan, in LA, and other places. So I don't know how that works out, but it can't work out well in the long run, right? We saw Google this week come out and say that they're not going back to the office until next year, July of next year, which was a
I thought was a very bold statement. But probably what a lot of corporations are thinking without saying it is that, they're not really comfortable going back until there's a true vaccine or therapeutics or whatever it may be. No one wants to take that liability risk. So I just can't imagine the level of renegotiations and concessions and everything else that are going to have to go on, when people start to think about coming back to the office, and when corporations say, you know what, we're only coming back half speed, so we don't want to pay our full boat.
Yeah, it goes back to the whole topic we bring up seemingly every week, which is lack of transparency, right? You don't know how much space a company is going to want to keep on in the future. And then you also have the credit risk of some of these companies, right? Or the downsizing risk. Just this week we saw Schlumberger say that they're going to lay off 25,000 people. They have huge office spaces in Houston. I think they have one that's coming up for renewal next year, if I'm not mistaken, a really big swath, and then even a bigger swath, which is more of like a 26, 27 lease expiration. But at any point in time, they could throw that on the shadow market, and the numbers Lonnie was referring to go from being, a positive change to a negative change once again. So just a lot to really factor in right now in terms of pricing, spatial needs, and going concern, operations.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting concept there, Manus, in terms of, this kind of flies in the face of the open office concept that we've been hearing about for the last few years, where essentially, property owners were having to deal with tenants jamming as many people into their space as they possibly could. So there were no more private offices. Everything was open and exposed, and you just jammed as many people as you could into the space. If people come back to the office, those things are going to have to change. So you're going to have different office layouts. So maybe one silver lining in this is that potentially with office layout, being redone, you may have folks that still need the same square footage, even if there's less people in the office. As an owner of a building, that's what you're hoping at least.
I'm picturing Mark Zuckerberg having to hire a guy for the Facebook slide, that connects people from floor to floor. Every time somebody goes down it, a guy has to follow him bathed in Lysol to kind of ride down and clean the slide. So a worker goes down, and then, the Lysol guy goes down, and then another worker can go down, right? The accommodations are just endless that these open floor guys are going to have to make.
Well, WeWork was in trouble, and Flex Office was generally in trouble before all this happened. But it's funny, it'd be interesting to see if they can shift to, selling themselves as, hey, your company doesn't want to go back full time to your office space that you already have. Why don't you bring half your people here, or bring a quarter of your people here? And by the way, we've put up plexiglass, and we've got people spraying Lysol all day, every day, the whole thing. So I don't know. I doubt that, but I'm sure they're going to start thinking about that. Another thing was, we talked about this in hotel and retail. Remember when we said that Bezos threw down the gauntlet when he announced that they were spending $4 billion on keeping their workers safe? And we said all of these brick and mortar retailers are going to have to do that. The office buildings are going to have to do that too. How are they going to prove to their tenants that they're keeping the building clean and safe? I can't imagine, the increase in just cleaning and maintenance costs.
Yeah, I think you hit on another key point there, Joe. Anecdotally, I read an article this week that I believe WeWork said for the first time they actually have more corporate lessees than they have individuals. And so I think that downsizing is already occurring, which is really interesting, because I think they had positioned themselves as saying, in a market disruption or a downturn, we're going to see more people that are individuals, small entrepreneurs coming to our offices. And in reality, it's been more of the large corporations. But I think, to follow up on your point, the operating expense for office owners at this point is going to be something to watch closely into the future, because just by definition, those cleaning, sanitation costs, increased risks of insurance, et cetera, are going to be, likely to go up.
Well, I think it's time to get into the Hope Act, because I'm thinking about some of these property types that have weathered the storm fairly well, like office so far. If they're going to have a downturn, 3 months or 6 months or 9 months from now, they are going to miss the boat on this potential stimulus plan. So I wonder if there's some very enterprising landlords out there thinking about increasing their expenses by 150% to hit the threshold before the window expires.
Remember in elementary school how it always seemed like you had to eat lunch at like 9:50, right? You'd have 3 periods, and then 4th period you'd have lunch, right? That they would start at 7:30, and if you were really lucky, you could eat lunch at maybe 20 to 11, something like that. It was a screwy system because the day was from 8 to 2. You never were eating lunch at noon. And now I think with this new setup for offices, you're going to have a slot where you can go get lunch, right? And it's going to be like elementary school all over again. That, right? This week, sorry, Joe, you have the 9:45 lunch slot. That's when you're permitted to get in the elevator and go out and get lunch, and you have to be back by 10 after 10. There'll be a bell, right? and they'll probably do it floor by floor, right? The guys in Trepp, you have the 10:10 lunch today, and the 11:20, but the guys on the the 19th floor, right, from the law firm, they get the 10:05.
I can't help but think of Nurse Ratched, right, going over the intercom and saying it's medication time, except it's Lonnie, it's lunchtime. I'm not hungry, Nurse Ratched.
No more Jell-O for me.
I want my cigarettes.
Sloppy Joe's extra sloppy.
You've alluded to the HOPE Act, so I think we should talk about it. Lawmakers have introduced a bill, the HOPE Act, to provide relief to struggling hotels and shopping centers that weren't able to pause their mortgage payments. What do we know about this bill, and who will it help?
Sure. So
go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to say that I think it's always very impressive how lawmakers can come up with these, what are they called? They're not anagrams. What are they called? Acronyms. There you go. See, we're learning new words every week on the podcast. They can always come up with these very interesting acronyms for whatever bill that they're sponsoring. But, we've talked about this a lot over the last couple of months about what a potential stimulus could look like. I think the general consensus from CREFC and MBA and other people were that it could not be additional debt. It had to be structured as a preferred equity situation. So essentially what this bill is suggesting is that they set something up just like PPP, the Payment Protection Plan, right? Where financial institutions can buy a preferred equity stake in a property where the borrower has been struggling. And I have in front of me some of the eligibility requirements. So don't quote me on all of these, but I am reading from the bill. So the first one is that the borrower's revenue during any consecutive 3-month period between March 1st, 2020 and February of 2021 is at least 25% less than the revenue from the same period last year or the year before. So you have to have a 25% drop in revenue year over year for any particular quarter. I don't think that's going to be a problem for most hotels. A lot of retail probably is going to fall into that category. Offices, I doubt it. Industrial, maybe a multifamily here or there, a student housing potentially. The other thing is that they couldn't have been in default before March of 2020, so they couldn't have already been in trouble. And their debt service coverage ratio, their DSCR, had to have been at least 1.3x in 2019 or greater than or equal to 1.3x in 2017 and 2018. And last but not least, it's not owner occupied and they haven't already received some other sort of assistance. So the point is that the financial institution that's providing this preferred equity or buying the preferred equity can buy a 10% of the outstanding loan balance in preferred equity. And to give you a sense of what that means, I mean, if it essentially gives the borrower more than 12 months worth of principal and interest payments, generally, right? It depends on the amortization of the loan and the rate and things like that, but it should give them plenty of leeway to make their P&I payments, but it's also meant to be used for operating expenses, including salaries. So, I think Van Taylor, and there's also a Democrat, I can't remember the name, who's sponsoring the bill. Lawson. And, their whole thing is that, this portion of the industry has been kind of overlooked by all of the stimulus that has already happened. Also, I think what's interesting is that it doesn't require them to appropriate any new funds. It's actually going to go in with the CARES Act, which has already been passed. So they're just going to use funds that have already been appropriated for this. So, I think it's the best potential. If you want to do a bailout or a stimulus for this market, this is probably the best potential way of doing it that we can think of. The merits of doing a bailout or not doing a bailout, it's hard to really say. But I think that this deal makes a lot of sense. Now, I've been talking a lot, but the last portion of it is that the financial institutions providing the preferred equity will get some origination fees, just like in the PPP Act. They will also get a preferred return. I think it's 3%. And then they'll get a 1% servicing fee for servicing the preferred equity. So it's a good deal for the financial institutions providing the preferred equity. So hopefully that incentivizes a lot of banks to really ramp this up if it does pass. And I know the PPP, they put billions of dollars to work over a couple weeks. So I would assume that this would be a similar situation.
So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, if you're interested in seeing either the bill or the synopsis of the bill that was put together by Van Taylor's staff and Al Lawson's staff, we have it. We're happy to share it with you. So email us at podcast@trepp.com. It's pretty concise. Joe really walked us through it very, very closely. The borrower has a year to draw on the funds, so they don't have to take it and start accruing right away. They can prepay at any time. They must start prepaying after 2 years of drawing, but they have 7 years to pay it back. So, it's a really loose set of conditions for the borrower. It gives them a lot of time to solve their problems. It really is crafted in such a way that only hotels and retailers will probably be eligible, other than the other property types that Joe mentioned before. By and large, it's for them. The piece that they put out noted the hotel industry alone supports 29 million jobs, and that's really their emphasis behind this. We did get some comments about this from some of our listeners even before we cut the tape. I would say it was a mixed bag. Some people felt that it was going to slow down price recovery, that it was going to keep zombie companies alive, especially in places where there's excess supply. It's going to keep the market from clearing, and that's a legitimate point. Others believe that this is really a black swan event, and this is probably the best you can do for taxpayers, short of just writing checks without any kind of hooks at all, right? Or that would be a worse deal for taxpayers. It's probably the best deal you can do for borrowers, short of giving them cash. So it'll be something that's heavily debated. I think the odds of this passing 50-50, maybe less, right? They did have 100 co-sponsors behind this a couple weeks ago. But as we saw today in the news, they're having a tough time coming to an agreement on major things like unemployment extension, how long, how much, things like that. That's dominating the conversations between Democrats in the House and Senate and Republicans in the Senate. So this is probably not their highest priority. So if you're handicapping this, it's certainly no sure thing.
Yeah, I think there's some caveats in here which, make sense, right? If you take this preferred equity, you cannot pay any dividends out to the owner. You can't take on any additional debt. You can't lend, right? So they're trying to plug up all the loopholes, right? To take on this preferred equity and then lend the money out to somebody else, somebody who's an affiliate of the sponsor or anything like that. So I think if they going to do a stimulus, this seems to make the most sense. But like you said, I can't really tell whether stimulus is good or bad. I mean, is it something that we just get kind of addicted to when anytime a downturn occurs, we're going to have to take out these bazookas? That's kind of, I don't know where my head's at on this.
Yeah, I think
it's really, go ahead, Lonnie.
I think one of the interesting concepts here is, all these folks that are opportunistic on the sidelines with dry powder, every time we implement one of these, 90-day moratoriums or some sort of legislation that, continues that path, like nobody knows where the bottom is. Nobody knows when we're at the bottom and you're going to start the recovery. And so, it's interesting from a market perspective. If you're in the transactional business of acquisitions or opportunistic funds, when do you pull that trigger? Because you don't want to pay, market value for something now when you could have waited 6 more months and bought something at a great reduction. So I think that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the market reacts to that.
There's always contortions with stuff like this, winners and losers, and distortions, I guess, is really the word. So who are the early winners from this if this thing gets passed? Hotel owners, of course, right? They've bought themselves time and they don't have their backs to the wall like they do right now. Retail borrowers, retail owners, the same thing.
CMBS 9 longs.
Well, B-piece buyers for sure. Anybody who's in a first loss position. Now there's a better fighting chance that these things don't take losses, right? You're not selling these things for pennies on the dollar. So the guys at KKR and other B-piece buyers, right, have to love this deal if it goes through. As you said, CMBX longs, we did see CMBX have rallied nicely yesterday on the news that this bill had been put forth. So they would come out way on top. The shorts obviously would not be happy with this. And then lastly, the banks, right? This gives them an opportunity not only to make money, but to capture the relationship, right? If they're the guy who is servicing the preferred equity, I mean, they can't foreclose on this and they can't take the property over like a mezz lender can, but it does put them front and center with the borrower, and it gives them an opportunity to build this relationship while still making money. So, perhaps in the long run, some of these banks that operate in CMBS end up taking market share from the traditional banks, or maybe the banks themselves jump on this immediately and grow their footprint. Hard to say.
Yeah, and it's the capital treatment for these preferred equity stakes is the same as the PPP loans. So they're guaranteed by the Treasury. The banks can sell the preferred equity stakes back to the Treasury at 100% of par, plus some, servicing fees and stuff like that. So there's really no loss risk. And the capital treatment is 0%. So there's no risk-based capital associated with these, which essentially means, they don't have to hold any extra capital against it. So their return on investment is very high. So they're really incentivizing the banks to go out and do these types of things. I would say that, there's been questions coming to us from, different parties, and also kind of comments here and there about, is something like this, just going to benefit the billionaires? And I think there's always going to be that question, especially in today's day and age where, it's usually everything is one side or the other and there's no in between. Of course, there are very large companies that own very large portfolios. But I would say if you dive into the data, 50, 60, 70% of the hotels are owned by small owners, right? Now that's back of the envelope, gut check math, but I would say it's kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? There's a whole long tail of small owner operators who own, 1, 2, 3 hotels in a certain area. And those guys or gals who employ 100 people or so, they're going to get a lot of benefit out of something like this, just like the large, institutional owners are as well.
Staying with our regulatory update, there's a proposal to eliminate what is known as 1031 exchange, which gets its name, not as cool as the HOPE Act, from the IRS code that allows capital gains to be deferred. Lonnie, can you explain what it is and the impact?
Sure. So Joe Biden made an announcement last week, I believe, where he outlined a plan to fund some social programs by eliminating 1031 exchange for folks that make $400,000 a year or more. And so 1031 exchange, the commercial real estate market as a whole is considered somewhat inefficient. It's long-term holds. Even to do a transaction takes time. There's multiple parties involved. There are certain things that are pretty efficient, and the 1031 exchange is one of those things. Essentially, the IRS allows for investors that own real property to take proceeds from sale or gain on sale and immediately invest it into a new investment vehicle and defer the capital gains tax that would be normally incurred on those gains. And so this has been in place since 1921. It's been modified some over the years, most recently with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in December of 2017. They actually parsed out the personal property 1031 exchange components in that bill. So now it only pertains to real property. But in essence, investors, purchase a property, they hold it for a finite period of time, they sell it, they take those gains. In order to execute on a 1031 exchange, there's a few steps that they have to follow. The first is obviously they sell the property and they have a gain. The second is that they have to identify and give all of the proceeds to what's called a qualified intermediary. They have 45 days post-sale to identify 3 or other like-type properties that they want to procure after the sale of their initial property. And then they have 180 days in total post-disposition to actually execute some sort of an agreement on one of those properties. Now, in between the sale and the 180 days, they have to send a duty letter to the qualified intermediary, actually formally identifying the 3 or 4 properties that they're looking to acquire. Once they agree to a sales price, the transaction works fairly normal. Those proceeds from the qualified intermediary get wired, and then they have to report to the IRS on a form 8824 what they've done in terms of the transaction. So I was doing some research over the last couple of days to try to find just how big of a market this is. While I couldn't find any exact numbers, a couple of things popped out at me. One, there's a lot of qualified intermediary companies that act as the middleman in these transactions. So it tells you that there's a pretty profitable opportunity for those companies. And two, it seems like every time there's an election at the national level, the 1031 exchange is in the bullseye. It's survived up to this point, so I'm hopeful that it will continue to survive because I do think it's good for commercial real estate. It gives a little bit of an advantage to our market to keep people's money invested in our market. If they eliminate it, there's a likelihood that investors may look at alternative investments when reinvesting those funds.
I saw some guys on Twitter. I follow a lot of random real estate people on Twitter. One of them, I think, is a broker that specializes in this, and he said he's never been busier. It's kind of like when you hear somebody saying, a president or a congressman or somebody coming out and saying they're going to regulate guns. All of a sudden, Smith & Wesson's stock goes through the roof because everyone goes out and buys guns. A little different story here, but it seems like people may be thinking about locking in this, tax treatment before November. I don't think something would change. I don't think the law would change that quickly. And there's a lot of, entrenched interests that want to keep this law the way it is. So I don't think it would happen that quickly, but it's one of those things where these guys might see a spike in 1031 exchanges right at a time when price discovery is very tough.
Turning to corporate CLOs, we saw more credit downgrades and pricing drops. What should we be watching for today?
It just seems like there's just no end to the number of, bankruptcies or going concern notes or downgrades every single week. So managers in the CLO space have to be very nimble, and there's really no sense of where the bottom comes at this point. For the same reason, there's no visibility as to where we're going to go in 2021, right? We don't know if there's a vaccine. We don't know if there's a V-shaped recovery or anything else. But some of the stories we covered this week on our CLO research, Land's End, the retailer that operates largely through home delivery, they issued a going concern warning. Today, being Thursday the 30th, California Pizza Kitchen, which was a great place to take the kids back in the day, filed for bankruptcy. We had noted back in April in our research that they had hired Alvarez and Marcel to help them navigate the bankruptcy process. This week, that bankruptcy came through, and the firm will restructure its debts. Its $290 million term loan was pricing in the 40s recently. So that will be restructured. Men's Warehouse, Tailored brand, that bankruptcy is still kind of seemingly forthcoming every week. And lastly, Seadrill Limited, another one of the countless energy firms that seems to be on the ropes. They missed a loan payment in June but they reached a deal with lenders to convert the firm's term loan into new debt. And, that bankruptcy seems to be moving along as well.
So this is a huge week for earnings. I've been somewhat keeping track of a couple of them, but in the form of breaking news, Apple, Amazon, and Google or /Alphabet all beat expectations. They just reported after the bell right now. I'm just reading this from the Wall Street Journal. They have some bullet points. For the first time, this is negative. For the first time in its history, Google reported a decline in year-over-year sales. That's all their drop in advertising revenue. Amazon's revenue rose 40% to $88.9 billion this quarter, propelled by customers who have relied on online shopping. Obviously, Facebook posted diminished growth in the second quarter, but revenue was still higher than expected. And Apple's revenue of $59.7 billion was better than analysts expected. So that's, I guess, good news, especially if you own those stocks. I mean, pretty much everyone owns those stocks. Is the biggest in the S&P. It brings me to that question from before about the office space a little bit. It's good to see that they're continuing to do well. Hopefully that means they'll continue to pay their office leases, but it also brings the question up of they're doing so well with everybody working from home. They've been the driver of some of the largest, absorptions of commercial real estate office space over the last 5 or 6 years. It would be a tough thing if, some of these companies start really rethinking their real estate because they can still do this well from home.
Apple also announced a 4-for-1 stock split. So if you had your 1 share this morning, you're going to have 4 shares soon.
Nice. It's going to make me feel richer, even though it doesn't mean anything.
And this week, Target, Dick's Sporting Goods, Kohl's, Best Buy joined Walmart in announcing that their stores are going to be closed on Thanksgiving Day to prevent crowds in close contact. The downside for us is that the shopping season probably starts now. Any prediction how that's going to go?
Well, the good thing about being open on Thanksgiving, I was never an open on Thanksgiving guy. I thought it was kind of something I would never do, and I never did. But I'm going to go a little contrarian here and think that with the forthcoming election happening and everybody being on such tenterhooks, that people will want to escape the house as quickly as possible once the political debates, come out after the pumpkin pie and the all the the turkey and the yams and the string beans and everything else, and once the Cowboy game reaches halftime, and there'll be nowhere to go, right? That political debate that you've been trying to avoid all year long, the one day that you need to have a place to go, there's nowhere to go.
We always found a reason to run out of the house. You always need ice, right? I'm just going to go pick up some ice. I'll be back in about 2 hours, right? You always had to have that excuse to get out of the house, especially when there's 1,000 cooks in the kitchen.
I'm gonna miss the YouTube or the Twitter videos of people fighting over that $129 TV and punching each other in the face as adults. That's the part that'll be missing this year.
I wonder if it's going to increase profitability, right? I mean, first they're giving people great deals on that day, and then these places would get just torn apart, right? People breaking down doors, and they'd even call them doorbusters, right? And the sheer cleanup costs from these places and how could you possibly socially distance when people are breaking down the doors and racing to the 55-inch TV? I don't know. So it may be a real win-win for these companies closing that store on Thanksgiving.
So with that, we'll close. Thank you, Lonnie, for joining us today and offering your insights. Thanks to our producer, Keegan St. Ange. Join us next week as we look at what happened during the week and how it may be impacting you. If you have a question or feedback, send us an email at podcast@trepp.com. Until then, visit trepp.com for more info and subscribe to the Trepp Wire podcast with your favorite provider. Thank you for listening and stay well.
All right.